Hello, my name is Van Penner, and this is a brief explanation of how I arrived at my research question for my global political economy thesis. First off, I would like to note that my last name, Penner, in German is a derogatory slang term for homeless person. So you could say that interest in the dynamics of Germanic housing systems may come as my birthright, and that this interest was compounded by my time living in Vienna this summer, which is a city and a country which has developed and maintained an unrivaled stock of public housing and maintains a very considerable rental housing market. Now, housing studies is a relatively new field of study, which has tasked itself with understanding how housing is provided and why housing systems come to change. And much of this research falls into either one of two categories, either simply describing descriptive differences between jurisdictions, such as social policy research, which will measure the magnitude of homelessness or the degree of home ownership between two different jurisdictions without prescribing any kind of theoretical basis for why this would be or how it would change. Or universalizing theories of housing systems, such as neoliberalism, which see state retrenchment and market provision as the most efficient and effective way of providing housing, or globalization theses, which see housing, the degree of deregulation in housing finance, as the sole determinant in housing regimes. And in between these two poles lies a tradition of critical study, which has drawn many aspects of welfare state theory, which sees housing systems as a function of the power balance between labor and capital, and the specific national institutions which mediate that difference. Now, of these middle range theories, the most developed and comprehensive is easily Jim Kemeny theory of housing regimes, which sees housing development as a reflection of the specific ideological approaches to welfare provision within different countries. Now, Kemany's thesis, in short, is that social housing will follow one of two paths. It'll either be run as a targeted, means-tested program aimed at those who can't achieve home ownership, so as not to compete with the market provision of home ownership and rentership, of private home ownership and rentership, that is, creating a dualist system, or it'll mature to the point where it can reinvest its surpluses to maintain its housing stock, which will compete with private rentership to drive rents down and allow rentership to compete with home ownership as the dominant form of tenure. And Kemeny focuses his analyses on England, Germany, and Sweden, England representing the dualist market, and Germany and Sweden both representing unitary markets. However, the unitary systems and welfare regimes in both Germany and Sweden have since converged in many ways with the dualist systems. This has been clearly demonstrated by the work of Mark Stevens, whose recently published case studies on Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom have revealed the increasingly neoliberal character of all three jurisdictions. And this has prompted a precipitous decline in the social housing stock in both Sweden and Germany, both of which are obviously formerly unitary systems. And so specifically, Stevens argues that Kemeny has overestimated the sustainability of his maturation thesis due to a failure to properly conceptualize the relationship between changes in welfare provision and housing provision more broadly. And Stevens provides a more comprehensive framework to pursue housing research, which will be outlined later. And Stevens, as well as critics and commentators such as Michelle Norris, have suggested that similar analyses, as to the case studies that Stevens put forward earlier, except this time applied to other unitary regimes, which have, in contrast, maintained more robust housing stocks, social housing stocks, and welfare states, such as the Netherlands, Austria, and Denmark, would provide a more clear understanding of the specific mechanisms which cause unitary systems to decline. Which brings me to my research question. So my research question is, despite the unitary systems in Germany and Austria being very similar historically, in the last 30 years, Austria has maintained its cost rental housing stock, whereas Germany has not. And I want to know what has caused this difference. And so to answer this question, I plan to apply Mark Stevens' multi-layered housing regime framework to Austria's housing system and compare it to the existing study of the German system. So Stevens' framework evaluates the condition of the labor market, taxation, social security, and other measurements of welfare state provision as determinants of the boundaries of possibility relating to social housing, all of which interact with macro-level drivers such as macroeconomic policy, financial deregulation, and organized political pressure, which are mediated through political institutions in these countries. And so data will include the measurements of welfare state provision, such as poverty rates after social transfer, unemployment, income distribution, housing structure, so tenure by income group to see the extent to which means tested forms of provision are prevailing, magnitude of cost rental stock to see how declines have been managed, if they have been, an analysis of the political institutions which control and regulate housing and the effects of financialization. And then compared to Stevens's German study to try to determine what the specific mechanisms are which from welfare states which cause the most profound change in housing systems. Thanks for listening.